Anyway, one of the new government's first 100 days promises is action on medical cannabis. What does that really mean? I'm not sure they know. And what to make of the promises of a referendum on cannabis law reform. There's one guy I always ask about this stuff because he's a pot geek and he knows. It's Chris Fowlie, the president of Norml New Zealand. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Russell.
So we have not law reform promised, but a referendum. How do you feel about that?
Well, on the one hand, we're very positive because we think we will comfortably win any referendum. But I think we've got concerns over what exactly the question's going to be, whether it's going to be binding and how long it's going to take. If we're looking at the 2020 election and then a law change after that, which might take 2 years, 3 years, then you're talking at current arrest rates, we're going to have 50,000 people arrested at about $1.5 billion cost in that time. So, yeah, we're kind of concerned about the time frame.
But I guess there are some advantages to a referendum in that it makes sure the conversation has to be had.
Exactly, yep. And it gives us 3 years to have a really good conversation. But again, it comes back to being binding. If we want people to get inspired by this referendum, if we want them to turn up and vote for it, it's got to be something progressive. I don't think people are really going to be, if it's something like fines or something really insipid. At the moment, all we have to go on is it's a referendum about legalising personal use, is what we've heard in the media. We don't really know much more about that. But is it limited to use? If you're legally allowed to use it, then are you allowed to grow it, or are you allowed to share it? Are you allowed to buy it? So these are the sorts of questions we need to have. But yeah, we've got 3 years to have it.
It strikes me, I mean, you, as Norml, have been advocating a long time. This seems like a very important few years for you.
Exactly. I think we're in a new phase, so everything that we've done up till now, there's a lot of people celebrating, right? There's a lot of people thinking that we're going to have legalisation tomorrow, people thinking that it's already happened as part of the coalition agreement. Yeah, there's a bit of getting ahead of ourselves there. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a big couple of years for Norml.
Yeah. So. Yeah, what we've done in the past in terms of our activism and our organising, I think that's in the past, and we're in a new phase now, and we've got to really reach out to a whole lot of other organisations and really broad sections of the community, and work to a common plan so that we're not at cross purposes, and we're going to have to look at some decent funding as well to really do it properly.
Where's that going to come from?
Well, that is the interesting question. Overseas, when you look at places like America, when they have binding referenda, so then people can actually make a kind of investment decision and go, well, okay, if I fund this, it will happen, and not just be years and years of talking about it, then you do find kind of wealthy individuals step up and for the good of it go, yes, let's fund that. If it's not binding, that might be a lot more difficult. You also might find that some of the people in Australia, there are some really big businesses that have been created in their medical cannabis industry over there, which is very industry focused. They actually have fewer medical cannabis patients approved in Australia than we do in New Zealand, even though we hear that it's been legalised over there, but actually it's like only about 100 patients that have got it. But you have these multi-million-dollar businesses that can't bring products to market because they've gone down this pharmaceutical route. So it's possible that some of those companies, which, as I say, are now very wealthy or very kind of well-resourced, might view if they can help reform in New Zealand and actually help them in Australia too.
What do you make of Labor's first 100 days promise on medical cannabis? Because I'm not sure I understand what they've promised.
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone does actually. Again, we don't really know what's going on there. We're trying to find out. We're coming up with our kind of our bottom line that we can present to them and try and work with them on that. But again, this kind of deadline they've created for themselves with 100 days, it is really good to have action. And it's one of our things that we want, is we want these changes to have immediate effect, not just be kind of creating a product development pathway that takes 5 or 10 years like a pharmaceutical, but we need something immediate. So it's good to have it in that 100 days, but our worry is that they don't really know what they actually want yet, and they may, this is the risk, get captured by the bureaucrats who may recommend just some minor kind of tinkering, a bit like what we saw with cannabidiol, the CBD, that again was reported all around the world as New Zealand has legalised medical cannabis, and that happened in September, and not a single prescription for cannabidiol has been granted.
Why not?
Well, they'd still keep it a controlled drug for a start. So it's actually, they've just carved out this little exemption that makes it a little bit easier, but it's still being treated like a controlled drug rather than a medicine. And there are no actual products approved because they haven't created any kind of mechanism to get them approved.
And yet it seems that New Zealand actually has quite a good industrial tradition of growing plants for attributes. We could do this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the wine industry or even our sort of craft beer industry or the hops down in Nelson, there's plenty, we're definitely an agricultural country, and in fact, if you look at Australia again as a kind of example of what's going on, one of the big companies that's got involved there is Tasmanian Alkaloids. They're the #2 poppy producer in the world, and they now have a subsidiary in Tasmania to grow medical cannabis. Yeah, you could easily envisage something like that here. Now, we, of course, don't want that to be the only route because you then end up with these problems like you've got in Australia where it just takes too long and it's all about big business. That's an option that needs to be there, but you also need to have an ability for patients to grow their own, and especially for domestic production, because we want to get those prices right down so it's actually affordable and accessible to people, not just a kind of pipe dream of sometime in the future.
You talked about the pharmaceutical route as a bad thing, but I do kind of get what doctors are saying when they say, I'm not going to prescribe something whose potency and composition I don't know.
Yeah. I only think it's a problem if it's the only choice, because at the moment there are no products that meet that, and they're trying to deal with what is a herb or a plant through laws that are essentially designed for novel synthetic substances and all that. We're not saying that pharmaceutical approach is bad, but that there should be multiple options for people. And if you look at, say, opiates, which are a much riskier substance, you do have things like morphine and heroin and things available under medicines as well as being controlled drugs. But then you can also have poppy seed bagels in your bread or poppy seeds in your food. And that's not illegal. So you can have an approach like that for cannabis, where you treat it as a herb or a food at one level, and so that people can have their own. But if you want to prepare it as a medicine, then it goes through a pharmaceutical process.
Yet at the moment there does seem the fairly urgent matter of so-called green fairies being arrested. And I think even if you doubt the efficacy of some of the products, I don't think they're doing anyone any harm, and yet they are being dragged into court. What should happen there?
Well, I think especially with the change of government and the pathway to reform that they've laid out, with the medical cannabis taking priority, this referendum happening, the police need to be aware of that, change what they're doing. They could easily declare a moratorium on arresting people, or at least certain conditions. This is completely within their powers. And in fact, the police hierarchy in response to any media inquiries always say that officers have discretion. So what we need is for officers to actually start using that a lot more. Now, when the police have been busting these green fairies recently, they've become aware that it's medical and they've proceeded with it. Now, they could actually stop at that point and not proceed with it. This is totally within their powers. We all see this with driving down the road, where the police tolerate going to 60 or 110, or they tell you when they're changing that. It's really well publicised. Everyone knows what the tolerance is. It's not a guessing game or up to individual officers. It's very well stated. So this is what we think the police should do, especially as we're trying to have this conversation. Because if half the country is a criminal, you can't really have an open, honest discussion.
And just finally, my impression is that we will follow, if there's any model we'll follow, it's Canada. They're a fellow liberal democracy. They're taking a very methodical, cautious approach. Do you think we'll look to Canada?
Possibly. I think we need to learn from all countries out there that are doing it, and also pay attention to what's unique about New Zealand. Some of the concerns with Canada is that it's a little bit government-centric. They're sort of trying to set up an agency and have all cannabis supplies go through this government agency.
In some provinces, it's a government monopoly, isn't it?
But also, while they're putting this law through to create what they're doing on that level, they're closing down dispensaries and arresting a whole bunch of people, and it's kind of a bit of a dog's breakfast in Canada, but yeah, I see what you mean. It is a similar country that I think we could definitely learn a lot from.
Cool.
A question.
Oh, okay.
Do you think there's an issue of inclusivity when it comes to the wider discourse around drug law reform in terms of a lack of understanding?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of myths, of course, and a lot of issues around language that we use that create different impressions. I mean, even when people talk about recreational cannabis, it kind of just in the word it implies partying in the streets or kind of being a bit irresponsible. So we prefer to call that adult use rather than recreational use, and then you find people are a lot more receptive to it. But certainly users need to be at the heart of any conversation around it. And as I say, if the police are still going hard arresting people, then that's really difficult to do. So they at least need to say some public statements about, hey, we're actually calling a halt to the arrest so that we can have this conversation.